All right. Hey, and thank you everyone for coming today. Um, let me start by giving you some background. There's a uh, there's a philosopher at Princeton. His name is Peter Singer. You might have come across his writings because he's done a lot of stuff for animal rights. He's also got a little infamous for what he's written about euthanasia. But today I want to focus on an article, at least at the beginning of this talk, that he wrote in the 1970s. I think he wrote in 1972, called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And in this paper, he presents something called the shallow pond thought experiment. And so I just want to start off by giving you that thought experiment to give you context for what the rest of the talk is about. So this is a quote. If I am walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. So that's a quote. So the idea is that, you're walking along, you see a child drowning on a pond. For you to say, hey, I don't want to get my clothes dirty, I'm not going to save the child, that would be seen as, morally reprehensible. And just out of curiosity, how many people think that you have an obligation to save a drowning child from a pond? Just raise your hand if you do. Okay. So this might also be a test of who can find the raise the hand function, but looks like most people are in fact raising their hand. So I'll take it as pretty much. And Peter Singer pretty much takes that as a given for his argument. So glad we're on the same page there. Okay, so what he says about this is the idea that you should save that child is a application of a more general principle. I want to be very careful how I state his more general principle. So again, I'm going to quote it directly because, words matter here. He writes, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. And so that's the principle that he talks about in his article. And it's actually the main principle I'll be talking about during this talk. And the question is, this is a pretty innocent sounding principle. And does it make sense? And should you live by it? So again, I'm going to repeat it one more time. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. Okay, so seems innocent enough. Why is anyone worried by that? Well, Singer writes that this principle is more controversial than you might think. The uncontroversial appearance of the principle just stated is deceptive. If it were acted upon, even in its qualified form, our lives, our society, and our world would be fundamentally changed. So why is this? Why does he argue that this is such a fundamental change in the way that we think about living? So one thing he argues is the principle has nothing to do with proximity. We have the same moral obligation to someone on the other side of the world as we do for someone that we happen to stumble upon while taking a walk. If we could, for example, prevent a child living in the Congo from dying of malaria by donating $2 to buy a mosquito net, then we have a moral obligation to do it. Proximity to the person who is suffering has nothing to do with our moral obligation. So one thing he immediately tries to establish is, just being close to the person who happens to be drowning doesn't change your moral obligations to people who might live, geographically much farther away. From this, Singer concludes that there's really no distinction between obligation and charity. And this is where the radicalness of the principle comes in. Most people think you have a duty, you're obliged to save a drowning child in front of you. I mean, if you didn't save a drowning child in front of you, you'd be a horrible monster. Shame on you. But most people think that you don't have a duty to perform all sorts of different acts of charity. For example, if you want to spend $2 on saving a child who lives on the other side of the world from malaria, then that's admirable. Good for you. However, you could also spend that money on a Starbucks latte, and that's fine. The charitable man may be praised, but the man who's not charitable is not condemned. So there's a distinction made between things that you're sort of obligated to do and things that you just do out of charity. But Singer wants to argue that this distinction between obligation and charity, given the way the world actually is, he can imagine other possible worlds where this wouldn't be true. But given the current state of horrible suffering in the world, this distinction between obligation and charity cannot be maintained because, quote, we ought to be preventing as much suffering as we can without sacrificing something else of comparable moral importance. We should be devoting our full lives to performing moral acts. Every time you buy a latte from Starbucks, you should be condemned. It's not, you don't have a right to buy a latte from Starbucks because you're condemning a child to death. So here, it might be useful to introduce a word, the word supererogatory. It's a fun word. Supererogatory means going beyond the requirements of duty. So most of us believe that certain things we do are a matter of duty. Certain things are like, going beyond duty, and we should get, applause and praise and maybe a nice award on a stage for it. But Singer doesn't believe in that distinction. Again, given the current state of the world, Singer believes that you're obligated to devote your entire life to reducing human suffering. So given this current state of the world, there's no distinction between things that you're obligated to do and things that, it's kind of nice for you to do, it's charitable for you to do. So that means that after you drain your entire bank account, you give all the money off to help people with malaria nets, you're then required to spend every waking moment laboring to reduce other people's suffering. Singer is very explicit about this. Only until you have descended to the same level of suffering as the people that you're trying to help are you allowed to stop. Singer writes, quote, we ought to give until we reach the level of marginal utility. That is, the level at which by giving more, I would cause as much suffering to myself or my dependents as I would relieve by my gift. It's nice he threw as or my dependents in there. But anyway, basically you should give until it hurts as much as the people who are, you're giving to. As soon as you've hit the level of suffering, then you can stop. And anything less, it's just not being a good person. So Singer is aware that this is a very radical ask. There's no question of that. He writes that if everyone acted on the principle that he's advocating, then, quote, our lives, our society, and our world would be fundamentally changed. All right, so that's Peter Singer's argument. So before we start talking about that argument in more detail, I did want to raise a question about whether people actually could live in the way that Singer wants. Would normal humans ever be able to attain this saintly level of sacrifice? Would we want to live in a world populated with these types of saints? So there's an author, her name is Larissa McFarquhar, and she wrote a book entitled Strangers Drowning. And the interesting thing about the book is devoted to examining people who have done exactly this, to people she calls do-gooders. And she calls do-gooders because do-gooders both sounds like, it describes them, because all the people that she describes try to do more than anything else in their life. They try to do good. They just focus on devoting every moment of their life to doing good. But the other reason she uses the word do-gooders is, do you guys know Ned Flanders from The Simpsons? Sort of that do-gooder mentality that we mock. There's something about do-gooders that we're very suspicious of. We're super suspicious of their motivations, and maybe we think that sometimes we think that there's just probably something wrong with them, or they're confused. And so there's also that other notion of do-gooders, which she very consciously plays off of. And so she tells a lot of stories. I recommend the book. It's really interesting. She talks about, for example, a leper colony that was formed in India. She talks about she talks about a lot of people who've gone to extremes to be able to help the world, in some cases endangering their whole family, just, beyond what you would expect from normal people. But I want to focus on one life that she talks about, because this is an example. Actually, it doesn't seem that radical. It only seems radical by inches as you go through and see how this person decided to live their life. But everything about this person seems like, she's following Peter Singer's principle. And so it seems like a doable life. And the question is this a life we should admire? And is this a life that, we should really try to imitate in our lives? So I want to talk about the life of Julia Wise. That's her name, Julia Wise. And so Julia, she believes that because each person was equally valuable, she was not entitled to care more for her own well-being than for anyone else's. She believed that she was therefore obliged to spend much of her life working for the benefit of others. So that's pretty close to Peter Singer's principle, but she wants to say there's nothing special about her. And in fact, there's nothing special about the people that are close to her above anyone else in the world. And so in all of her actions, she wants to do stuff that is just as much as to the benefit of other people in the world as it's a benefit to herself or to her loved ones. So in college, Julia considered doing development work abroad. But then after some additional thought, she decided, you know what, going off abroad might feel good. It might make me feel good about what I'm doing, but it would actually be much more effective if I continued to work in the United States, made a bigger salary, and then donated the money to an NGO. And then people on the ground in another country would know how to spend the money better, and it would cost less. It costs a lot less to hire a bunch of people in another country to be able to work in that country than, to ship me, a white, United States woman off to another country to do some work that she might not be super qualified to do. So she got a job as a social worker, and she reduced her expenses to a minimum so she could donate almost all of what she earned. And we'll get into that a little more in a moment. But she originally, she decided that she was never going to marry anyone. She was going to live her life on her own because of the way that she was deciding to live her life. She wasn't sure anyone could ever live with her because she wanted to donate all of her money. But she, as it happens, she fell in love with a man named Jeff, and they did. She proposed to him, and they decided to get married. And after she proposed to him, before they got married, right after college, they had a date in an apple orchard. And Jeff bought her a candied apple. It's a date. He got her a candied apple. But she had an interesting reaction to this present. That night, while laying in bed with Jeff, the purchase of the candied apple weighed on her. Quote, this is a quote, "With her selfish, ridiculous desire for a candy apple, she might have deprived a family of an anti-malarial bed net or deworming medicine that might have saved the life of one of its children." The more she thought about this, the more horrific and unbearable it seemed to her, and she started to cry. So this was incredibly traumatic. And this was a $2 candied apple that was given to her by, the person she was in love with. And so this prompted a conversation. And so Julia and Jeff had to decide how could they live together, given her extreme desire to be able to give all of her money away. And Jeff was sympathetic to her cause. And so what they decided to come up with was separate budgets. And so Julia decided that she would give away 100% of the money that she earned. And Jeff would give away 50% of what he earned. And now the remaining money, Jeff and Julia would take $38 a week to spend, quote, on everything other than rent and food, things such as clothes, shoes, transportation, and treats like candied apples. So they got $38 a week. And Jeff went to enforce this. So he said that if Julia did not spend the $38 on herself, then he would turn around and send a matching amount of money to the Republican Party. So this was his way of trying to enforce that the money was actually spent on enjoyable things. So over time, they kept, making more money and adjusting their income and how much they donated to charity. And by the time they got to the year 2014, they were donating $127,000 to charity just in 1 year. So of their, and we're talking about, she was a counselor in a prison. We'll get to that in a moment. And he was a programmer. So we're not talking about, ultra wealthy people, but 127,000 for 1 year is pretty good in 2014, that they were able to live so frugally and give away so much of their income. At the beginning, they donated all of their money to a charity called Oxfam. Later, they started to give their money to an organization that I think people at this church have heard of before, called GiveWell. And so they admired GiveWell's, very analytical approach to deciding on which charities to donate to. So Julia believed that the money she donated meant much more than her social work. So she worked as a counselor in a prison, and she really enjoyed that work. She loved the experience of helping people individually and getting that emotional satisfaction. But she knew that it was a trap. That feeling of emotional satisfaction by working for others was a form of selfishness. So she writes, people are really bad at thinking of money and lives as interchangeable, but they are. Like today at work, we were talking about the teenager who decided to sail around the world and then had to be airlifted out of the Indian Ocean. How much money was spent on saving that one life? And there are other situations where we spend huge amounts on some expensive medical procedure, and we're willing to think of that life as infinitely precious, but we're also willing to stand by while lots of people die for stupid and preventable reasons. I think we should think about how things would be if we had to treat sick people equally, rather than keeping a lot of them hidden in Haiti. I heard on the news that a second person died in Arizona after being denied an organ transplant because the state cut 1.4 million from its transplant program. All I could think was, that much money and only 2 people died? So both Julia and Jeff worried about their jobs. As I mentioned, Jeff was a programmer, Julia was a social worker, but Julia was very aware that she didn't make as much money as she could. If Jeff could also be making more money if he was more aggressive about his work, and therefore both of them could be donating more. They both pondered the question, quote, was there really any difference between choosing not to earn more money and spending their money on a new sofa or fancy clothes? Had they in effect been paying with the suffering of other people for the privilege of feeling wholesomely poor? So this is something that weighed on them by picking jobs, even though, in her case, she's a social worker and she's working directly with people in prison. Is she actually doing something wrong by not becoming, say, a stockbroker and maximizing her income and then turning around and donating that money, even if it would make her go crazy and suffer horribly because she has no emotional connection to the work? So Larissa, in her book, Strangers Drowning, describes several other do-gooders like Julia and Jeff who attempt to devote their entire lives to doing good. These people don't appear to be crazy. I mean, otherwise they're not completely crazy. They don't walk around in robes and pretend they're saints or say crazy stuff. They just devote all their life to trying to maximize good. Larissa suggests that the subjects of her book are just less blind than other people. Larissa writes the following about Julia. The need of the world was like death, she thought. Everyone knew about it, but the thought was so annihilating that they had to push it out of consciousness or would crush them. She understood, and yet she did not understand why other people didn't give more than they did. How did they allow themselves such permission? She gave, and she was human just as they were. How could people ignore the misery and unfairness in the world? How could they not help? End quote. All right, so as this book illustrates, there are people, not especially religious people, who devote their lives to helping others. But should everyone, as Peter Singer demands, devote themselves to a life of doing good? Must we all follow Singer's principle? And again, reminder, the principle is, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without therefore sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. There's something that seems greedy about Singer's principle. Sometimes I just want to take my dog for a walk. But according to Singer, this is wrong. Because taking my dog for a walk distracts me from earning money that I could devote to buying mosquito nets for children in the Congo. If I make $40 an hour and I take a half-hour walk, then I've done the moral equivalent of murdering 10 children. Well done. So a good person should be devoting every waking moment to relieving suffering in the world, and the person is suffering as much as the least happy person. There is a sense in which if you follow this principle, then you've given up all of your free will. A computer could calculate what you should be doing in every situation to maximize the reduction of human suffering. You should be told by that computer what to do, and it has nothing to do with your personal desires. In fact, as we saw from Julia, your desires can mislead you. They can get you into, trying to help people because of the emotional benefit instead of trying to maximize good. I'm going to mention that Peter Singer himself had trouble living up to this principle. When Peter Singer's mother developed advanced Alzheimer's, Singer, in violation of his theories about both giving and personhood, had spent a lot of money paying nurses to take care of her. Quote, "Perhaps it is more difficult than I thought before," end quote, he said, "because it's different when it's your mother." Of course, it's completely unfair, although I just did it, completely unfair to criticize Singer's principle just because Singer himself is not able to always live up to his principle. But this does highlight how contrary to human nature Singer's principle is. It's extreme. Just to get a sense of how extreme it is, the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah has pointed out that actually, if you came across a child drowning in a pond, the right thing wouldn't be, according to Singer's principle, to save the drowning child. A strict utilitarian would not rescue the child from the shallow pond at all. He would leave the child to drown, sell his unmuddied clothes, and donate the proceeds to a charity that could save more than one child with the money. So that would be the right thing to do. Let the child drown, sell your clothes, save 5 children. All right. So I think we find these stories of do-gooders perverse because we know that humans cannot be reduced to a single dimension. We are more than just moral characters, more than just moral creatures. Most people have a number of conflicting desires. We want to help others at the same time as we want to help ourselves or our immediate family, or for that matter, help no one at all. I think humans innately have a desire to help others. We tip waiters, even when visiting cities that we will never visit again. We donate to victims of tsunamis, even when the victims live on the other side of the world. We have an innate desire to do good. This is a fact about human psychology. However, I also enjoy teaching my son how to ride a bike, watching a movie, and yes, even buying a latte occasionally from Starbucks. We want to do these things also. These are also facts about human psychology. At the end of the day, human morality must be driven by human psychology. Peter Singer is overly focused on one aspect of what drives us, so I reject his principle. Sometimes I just want to take my dog for a walk, and I'm not a monster for doing it. So let's dive into this a little more. Let's dive into my motivations for taking my dog for a walk. And I'm going to get really, really technical here. I'm going to enumerate 5 reasons why I think I want to take my dog for a walk. Reason number 1, I feel empathy for my dog. My dog starts whining when he wants to walk. He'll just, stand out there outside this office and start making whiny noises. And I want to take my dog for a walk to reduce his suffering. It's pretty straightforward. Number 2, I know that taking a walk will clear my mind and increase my productivity. It's just something, if I sit too long in front of a computer, I'm going to get less done than if I get out and walk around. Number 3, I enjoy the feeling of sunlight on my skin. It's not always true in Seattle, but when there's a sunny day, I enjoy, feeling of sunlight. Number 4, I know that taking walks is good for my health. And number 5, taking a walk has entertainment value for me. I want to see how much progress the person down the street has made building their house. So these are 5 reasons. I just came up with them. They're sort of entangled. Some of them are, sort of selfish reasons. Some of them are, you could claim, are non-selfish. But I think there are a complicated set of reasons. And I don't think that they're all sort of purely, by Singer's cold calculus, are designed to improve happiness in the world or reduce human suffering. So let's go through them a little more carefully. So I said the first reason I would want to take my dog for a walk is because I feel some empathy for the dog and I want to reduce the dog's suffering. Now, Singer, as I mentioned, he's a famous animal rights activist. He thinks we have just as much obligations to other living creatures on earth as we do to humans. He would definitely recognize the importance of this principle. Empathy for animals is something important to him. However, perversely, he wouldn't accept trying to relieve my dog's suffering if I could do more by ignoring my dog's whining and instead give money to an animal shelter and save the lives of many dogs. At the end of the day, he wants to do the math there. And my listening too closely to the suffering of one dog would not move him because I could turn around and save multiple dogs by giving money to an animal shelter, by ignoring my whining of the dog, working a little longer, making some more money and donating to a shelter. Remember, Julia felt the same conflict when working as a counselor in a prison. She felt emotional satisfaction over directly helping other people. But at the same time, she felt a lot of guilt over it because she knew she could relieve so much more by quitting her, quote, feel good prison counselor job. Shame on you, Julia, for your feel good prison counselor job, becoming a stockbroker and donating cash to give well. So moving on to number 2, going on a walk to clear my head to increase my productivity. Singer, I think, would recognize the importance of number 2. I mean, presumably, Singer would think it's okay for me to eat food and drink water occasionally so I don't die from starvation, because it's pretty hard to donate to charity if I'm dead. So he does recognize, the importance of being able to take care of myself at least enough to be able to continue to work to reduce human suffering. And, for the same reason, for the third one, for taking my belief that taking a walk is good for my health, he might give me some leeway there. If I'm, working to release suffering and being healthier would help me be more productive, then sure, he might say, okay, it's okay for me to take a walk if it would maximize the amount of human suffering I could reduce. But now we get to reason number 4, feeling sunlight on my skin. Oh, no way. That one's not going to pass. Singer is not going to be happy with that one. That is completely unimportant from Singer's greedy morality perspective. It seems so petty and selfish that I want to feel the temporary pleasure of sunlight on my skin when, after all, people are dying in the world. So me walking around trying to have a moment of pleasure when there's people suffering in the world, that's just perverse. Same for reason number 5, the entertainment value. Really, I'm not even going to try to justify this one. My, idle curiosity about what's happening with my neighbor's house, when again, I could be sitting there making money by writing some code. What am I even thinking? There are Ukrainians right now suffering in refugee camps. What am I doing, wandering around the neighborhood? All right. So there are many tangled up motivations for my taking a dog for a walk. I just tried to list 5 of them. I'm sure there's many more. Some of these reasons are selfish, some altruistic. I'm not always clear on why I do things. I don't always go through and try to enumerate the reasons why I'm doing things. But from Singer's perspective, I should sit down and separate out my, the reasons for my actions, figure out which of them are altruistic and which ones are selfish. But remember, Singer doesn't even stop there. Even if I just focused on being altruistic in all my actions, I don't get to decide which altruistic things I can do. I can't decide to have a feel-good job as a prison counselor. I need to do the cold calculation of reducing world unhappiness for the aggregate and not the individual. So at the end of the day, sorry, Rover, you don't get your walk. Peter Singer says no. So I personally think this conclusion is perverse. As people who've listened to some of my other talks know, I believe that, like David Hume, that at the end of the day, foundations of human morality have to be found in human psychology. Feeling empathy for my pet dog is really the only reason that I care about animal welfare in general. Convincing me to turn my back on the suffering of my dog for the benefit of all dogs, it's not going to work for me. My conclusion is that being moral is just one psychological impulse, one psychological motivation among many. It's natural to want to help people in pain, but it's also natural to want to feel sunlight on my skin. Peter Singer has not justified why one psychological impulse should dominate all the others. All right. So I'm going to stop there so we have time for discussion. But I did want to open up the discussion by throwing out some questions. And these are just suggested questions. So one, I will ask you the sort of fundamental question: is it ever okay to spend money on a Starbucks latte when that same money can be donated to save human lives? So let's ponder that. Question number two, is there a distinction between obligation and charity, between what I must do and what it's good to do? In other words, are there supererogatory acts? And then number three, am I obligated to save a drowning stranger? If a stranger is drowning right in front of me, is it okay to just walk away? What if I was watching the stranger drown over a live stream on YouTube? What if I was just reading about the stranger drowning in a newspaper article? So let me stop there.